first speaker, Sean Smith.
Okay, thank you very much, Miles. And thank you everyone for taking time out of your Wednesday evening to join this presentation. And thank you for taking an interest in sustainability. I think this is, the important question of our times, the environment, sustainability, and how we can mitigate some of the changes we've wrought over the 20th century in the 21st century and beyond. And so today I'm here to talk about one possible mitigation strategy, and that's in our soils. So I'd like to talk about how healthier soils can make a healthier planet. And the nice thing is that we're all connected to soil in some way. So that means everybody can take part in this solution, which is quite nice. I'm going to begin by asking everyone to take a moment. There we go. To think about your own context, where you grow, or do you grow, or do you have a connection to soil? Do you have a backyard? Are you part of a community garden or whatnot? So if you could take just a minute to think about where you are and the soil you're connected to, and to close your eyes for a minute and to imagine yourself in that space away from your computer right now, which is the antithesis of soil. And where is that place? And what's growing there? And can you put your hand in that soil? And if you were to do so, what would it feel like? What would it look like? What would it smell like? Where's the sun shining? Where are the four directions? And does water fall in great quantity here, or is it quite dry? And so on and so forth. And I'd like you to hold that image in your own mind as we go through the presentation, because even though we'll sort of toggle between the local and the global, it's important that local has a place for you, that you can tell a story about that soil, whether it's your backyard or whether it's a hike you took or whatnot. This is my place. This is Crooked Farmz. It's a backyard in East York that's been converted into what I jokingly refer to as 0.018 acres of farmland. And this is located in Treaty 13 territory, the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Chippewa, and is part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Treaty. And so here, when I'm in this space and place, I'm thinking about how can I care for this soil. And I started out when I moved to this place not knowing anything about soil. I was trying to become a better gardener, and failing miserably over time, and realizing that my problem was that I was trying to grow plants, but you can't grow plants if you don't have healthy soil. And so I realized I needed to start growing soil, or at least tending soil. And that began a journey a number of years ago that has become Crooked Farmz, the backyard farm and micro business today. One thing about this image, and you saw an image from Miles at the beginning of kind of this bird's eye view overhead drone camera shot. It's nice for me because I get to see a diagram of what the farm looks like. And at the same time, it's a reminder that quite like Zoom, we're missing the volumetric aspect of it. And that soil is what happens below the surface. And soil is also what happens above the surface. Okay, so when we think about soil, we're not just going to be talking about that dirt in our hand. We want to consider soil as a process that happens below and above the surface of the earth, or the surface of this image. So what is soil then? Well, it's a mixture of organic matter, minerals, gases, liquids, and organic matter, organisms that together support life with 4 important functions. Now, the one we're most familiar with, of course, is as a medium for plant growth. When we think of soil, we think number 1. What we often tend to neglect or forget are numbers 2, 3, and 4. That soil is a means of water storage, supply, and purification. Water is part of a cycle. Water is a cyclical process, and soil is an important part of that water cycle. And the ability for soil to hold water is an important component of it. Because of this role in holding water and purifying water through a water cycle, it then becomes, on a more global basis, a modifier of Earth's atmosphere. Okay, soil systems affect climate systems. And then finally, and this is number 4, the element that makes all 3 of these first ones possible, it's a habitat for organisms. And what we're going to be talking about tonight especially is the role of microbes in the soil to bring it to life, to bring plants to life, and to mitigate some of these other factors that we just talked about. Now, even though I'm a very tiny farm in the city, the internet allows us to connect to larger farms out in the surrounding areas of GTA and across Ontario and the world. And so we're very connected to the story of farming as it contributes to agriculture, but also the story of farming as it contributes to climate change. And conventionally tilled agriculture that we've seen over the last century of farming around the world, monocrop farming around the world, we have seen that the tillage of these soils and the intensive fossil fuels that go into tending them has released carbon into the atmosphere, CO2 into the atmosphere in gigatons worth of emissions. And this is from MIT over the past 12,000 years. Now, this, of course, goes much further back in the time scale, 110 billion metric tons of carbon from just the top layer of soil, roughly equivalent to 80 years worth of present day US emissions. Okay, and that's just from expansion of farmland, never mind how that farmland is actually being used. The good news is we've got innovative farmers now who are starting to understand the role of microbial life and water cycles in terms of replenishing the soils, increasing yields, and also you might I've heard this term, farmland becoming a carbon farming solution or a carbon capture sink. And this is going to have to do with the role of microbes. A couple of quick definitions: aerobic, anaerobic. Aerobic, when I refer to aerobic, I mean in the presence of oxygen or growing in the presence of oxygen. So aerobic soils have plenty of oxygenated air to carry out oxidative chemical reactions, such as soil organic matter decomposing and the cycling of nutrients within the soil. Okay. When we think of nutrients in the soil, this is not some sort of static thing. There's life in the soil that's continually doing chemical reactions to make sure that those chemical elements are available in nutrient form to plant roots. Anaerobic, by contrast, means in the absence of oxygen or growing in the absence of oxygen. We can think of soils that are heavy textured, like clay soils, or they have been compacted for various reasons by machinery, or they're super wet or flooded. They tend to be anaerobic because not enough oxygen is getting in there to allow them to breathe. This, on the one hand, inhibits plant growth, but also contributes to diseases in the soil. Okay. If we think about garbage dumps, what happens is food waste is there in a garbage dump, and it is a low oxygen or an anaerobic environment. And so that food waste, when it decomposes, instead of decomposing in the way we would like it to in a compost bin, it's in a low oxygen environment, and it produces methane, and it stinks. And we get these vile smells, and methane is a greenhouse gas, even worse than carbon dioxide. Okay, something like 20 times worse than carbon dioxide in terms of heating the planet. So we want to have aerated, open, oxygenated environments. The other definition we want to talk about is the organic versus the inorganic fraction. Soil is a combination of the living and the dead, or the living and the mineral. And this inorganic fraction is composed of rock, sort of the tectonic beginnings of our planet thousands and millions of years ago, and the types of rock formations that exist in various places around the world. And slowly each year they're eroded by wind, they're eroded by water, and they're eroded by microbes. And this kind of erosion of the mineral is what helps create soil. And then on the other hand, the organic, which is the microorganisms we talk about, dead animals and plants in various stages of decay. And if we look at this pie chart on the right, a typical soil is going to be made up about 45% of the inorganic fraction, 5% of that organic matter, and then these other two things, water and air. We're going to refer again, water and air. So soil has a lot of holes in it, has a lot of gaps between it if you look at a more micrological level. And air is coming through there and water is coming through there. And when water comes down, it pushes the air out and so on and so forth. Okay. That 5% though is the number that we're most interested in here, because conventional agriculture and conventional horticulture practices in our backyards has taken that number and it's gone 5, 4, 3, 2 to the point that in many cases the organic matter is next to non-existent. Okay, and that organic matter is where life thrives. The continuation of plant life on the one hand, but also the continuation of the ability to hold carbon down into the soil. And so the more we can increase that number and get it up over 5%, 6%, 7%, the better and more healthy our soils are, and we'll be able to grow better plants, but also capture more carbon into the soil. Now, those of you who are gardeners or growers of any sort are familiar with soil as chemistry. This is the kind of the 20th century model of gardening or farming. You need to know NPK. And when you go to the garden center and you purchase some fertilizer for your shrubs or vegetables in your backyard, you get those 3 numbers listed on the bag. NPK. So nitrogen, largely responsible for the green, the growth of the leaves on your plant. And don't forget, the leaves are where photosynthesis happens. So when our ability to, to capture light from the sun and turn it into energy is based upon the amount of available nitrogen in the soil. Phosphorus, on the other hand, goes down. It's responsible for root growth and flower and fruit development. And then potassium helps, generally everything in the plant. It's very beneficial. And of course, there are a number of other important key micronutrients. But as I mentioned already, chemistry is not what I'm interested in tonight. NPK is our touchstone because it's something we're familiar with, but now we're going to leave that behind, because what's really important is biology. And this is a well-known US soil scientist. And he says, when I walked out of school, I thought it was all about NP and K, because I mean, this is what's being taught, right? In agricultural colleges. And so Ray Archuleta says, I now think it is carbon. If you fix the carbon cycle, although you may have to use some NP and K to get there, and you stop disturbing the soil system, it's all about carbon. Organic matter is 58% carbon. So that 5% fraction that we talked about, if you actually look at what's in that organic fraction, 58% of that is carbon. So if we want to take carbon out of the atmosphere, we need organic matter in our soils. The root exudates are carbon. I'll come back to this term root exudates in a minute. Once you bring the carbon, you've got the soil biology going. The microbes are functioning, respiring, metabolizing. They are functioning and doing their business. And this is what we'd like to foster with healthy soils. This is a diagram called the soil food web. So if we think about our ecological webs, if we look at it from the perspective of the soil, we get back into that volumetric where what happens in the soil is also what happens above the ground. The plants, they capture the sun's energy and photosynthesis. Okay, great. What they're going to do is, number one, break down, die and wilt as organic matter and become part of that organic matter in the soil. But what they're also going to do is feed these microbes in the soil: bacteria, fungi, nematodes, and protozoa. And these four actors are the ones that are very depleted in our soils due to excessive use of synthetic fertilizer, excessive amounts of tillage. In the urban context of Toronto or Richmond Hill, the use of chlorinated water. It's a good thing for us to have chlorinated water for drinking because we don't want microbes in our bellies. But on the other hand, the more we put chlorine into our soils, we're killing off those microbes. So when you water your garden, and this is why it's always best to use rainwater if you can to water your garden, to have a rain barrel. Anyways, these microbes are not only breaking down organic matter, but they become food for worms and arthropods and the organic critters further up the food chain. And all of this together becomes what makes a healthy soil. Okay, but that focus right in the middle there with the bacteria, fungi, and protozoa are where we're really focusing our attention. So what is happening? The plant photosynthesizes. It feeds the soil microbes down below. The soil microbes are going to respire some of that because they're metabolizing as well. They don't breathe quite like us, but they respire. And some of that respiration is going to produce carbon dioxide that goes back into the atmosphere. But the more we can capture that in the soil as soil organic carbon, the more we are having healthier soils as well as healthier planet. Where is this taking place predominantly? In what we call the rhizosphere. The rhizosphere is the region of soil nearest the plant roots. And so it's only a couple of millimeters, maybe a centimeter. It's not very big, this area around a plant's roots. Now, what can happen is the healthier your plants get, the bigger that root system becomes. So now all of a sudden, even though the rhizosphere is quite a narrow zone around the roots, the more you can grow root systems and the more microbes can help in that process. Now, all of a sudden, the potential coverage of a rhizosphere grows quite dramatically. But there are far more microbes in the rhizosphere than anywhere else in the soil. And why is this? The concept is root exudates. I'm going to go down one slide first, and then I'll come back to that slide. What are root exudates? This is something very recent in terms of agriculture and soil health studies. But what we're learning is what they refer to as liquid carbon. Plants photosynthesize and take the sun's energy and not only convert it into energy for the plant growth itself, but they also take a proportion of that energy and convert it into proteins and sugars that are then leaked out the bottom of the roots of the plants, what we call root exudates. And it's these sugars that the microbes are coming to feed on, and they form these symbiotic relationships with plant roots in which the microbes come and get the sugars, aka the liquid carbon, and in return, the microbes are able to take nutrient matter that's in the soil and make it into forms that are available to the plant. So a plant can't just use nitrogen. It has to have the nitrogen fixed into certain forms chemically. The microbes are able to do that, and the sugars that are sent out by the plants actually are a complicated form or a complex form of a signaling system that tell the different microbes particularly what I need at this time, what to go out and get and bring back for me. Okay, and the microbes aren't necessarily going out. They're not driving to work, going at the microbes and the nutrients and bringing them back again. But that the fungi have filaments where they reach out. These are called hyphae. Fungal strands are called hyphae, and these hyphae reach out and are able to access nutrient from the soil and bring it back via this root exudate signaling system. So our four, we don't need to go through this, in super detail, but to say that our 4 main actors are fungi, which decompose organic matter, and they are able to literally break down stone. They are able to extract nutrient from not only organic matter, but sand, silt, and clay. Okay. Bacteria, on the other hand, do the same thing. Okay. And they're both right in the rhizosphere, and they're building a little bit of soil structure on a micro scale. Nematodes and protozoa, on the other hand, are going to be the next level up, and they're going to consume the dead bodies of bacteria and fungi as they metabolize and go through their lifespan. And they are going to take in the nutrients from the fungus, take in the nutrients that are in the bodies of the bacteria, and release it directly to the plant in that relationship, that partnership. And what ends up happening is, particularly with fungi, the fungi release a substance called glomalin that is like a glue, and it can take your sand, silt, and clay particles that are in your soil and start to bind them together. And so you start to see in your soil that you get aggregation taking place. You get clumps, and these clumps are very healthy because they hold a lot of organic matter. And therefore, as we've seen, that means we're holding a lot of carbon. I'm going to take a time out to go back to Ray Archuleta again. We're going to look at one quick 1-minute video to look at this idea of soil aggregates and the importance of having fungi in your soil and the importance of having this glomalin there binding the soil. So we'll just take 1 minute to look at this demonstration.
I have a question to ask you. Is your soil healthy, functioning, and stable? One of the best visual diagnostic tools that I know of is the soil stability test. Here are 2 soils, exactly the same soil type. This soil has been tilled for 30 years. This soil has not been tilled for 40 years. It is covered with diverse plants year-round. Watch what happens when we drop the soil in the water. Notice how the conventional tilled soil is falling apart. The biotic glues in the organic matter are burned up by tillage. The soil pores have collapsed. Notice the no-till soil. The pore spaces are still intact. Do this test for yourself. I guarantee if you dig a little, you'll learn a lot.
Now, obviously, Ray Archuleta is speaking to farmers here, but as I noted earlier in the slide, if you have a backyard garden, you're just a farmer on a really micro scale. And so I think it's important for us to think soil in the same way as farmers are implored to think about soil. And that when we think about some of the actions that we do in our gardens, we are just tiny farmers that are doing many of the same things. We overtill, we overdig, we leave soil bare, we apply synthetic pesticides and fertilizers. In the city, on top of that, we use chlorinated water, and so on and so forth. And you see the difference. I mean, he shows it to you very quickly, and we can learn from farmers in that regard. What ends up happening at a micro level, the fungal hyphae, these tendrils that they can reach out with, and the presence of shredding type of insects, they leave pore spaces in the soil that remain intact after the microbes die. At a larger scale of the food web, different earthworms coming through and consuming the bodies of these sort of dead creatures end up tunneling through the soils, and they are also creating aeration. What does that do? Well, if you remember, I mentioned what is a soil composed of, the pie chart at the beginning. 50% of that soil is water and air. And so what we're trying to do, the more aeration we can have, the more aerobic potential we have. It carries oxygen. and the more ability we have for water to flow down into it and be held in the soil rather than landing on the surface and pouring away. And taking, in many cases, taking our synthetic fertilizers with it. So water comes, it can't penetrate the soil because it's compacted, doesn't have this aeration provided by the creatures in the soil. Rain falls, it erodes the top layer of dry dirt. It takes away all the synthetic fertilizer you just put on the surface, and that's all going down to the sewer system and out to our waterways. And now we're seeing vast water system problems where we've got algae blooms and things like this that are happening because of excess synthetic fertilizer that's been trickling out this way. We've got soil erosion happening. And also now we've ruined the water cycle because instead of water being held in a sponge in the soil and then cycling, it's running away and going to another ecosystem altogether. I'd like to talk a little bit about this idea of fungal bacterial ratio. And this is the ratio of fungus to bacteria in our soil, in any soil. And I'm going to show a little diagram here because what we're looking at is something called ecological succession. And that basically it talks about what happens when a soil is bare or first disturbed or sandy beach. And we have a very bacterial dominated soil in this context. And this is what can grow here. Pioneer species or what we refer to as weeds. They're what happens when a soil has been disturbed. But what ends up happening is over time, as we can make soil more fungally dominant or a higher F to B ratio, a higher fungus to bacterial ratio, now we see other types of plants, types of plants start to thrive. So we get our brassica vegetables, we get our lettuces and our mid-succession grasses. We get our solanaceae, which are our tomatoes and eggplants and potatoes. We get further along, we get our shrubs in our backyard, we get trees, and then we finally get old growth forest. And what's an old growth forest? Well, you've had leaves falling in soil undisturbed for years and years and years. You have mushrooms. This is, of course, we see mushrooms on our forest walks. Why? Because it's a very well-developed fungal network. And so you've got this kind of a continuum from a heavily bacterial soil to one that becomes far more heavily fungal. And so we can change our soil. We can make it more fungal by the way we amend our soil and steward our soil to bring it back from where it's damaged or bare or has been over-tilled over time, and which is has got bacteria in it, and make it more fungal. And we're going to start to see some of these other processes taking place. How are we doing for time, Miles? We're doing great. Okay. And so the question becomes, what can you do? What can I do? What can we all do? And of course, you know, my gig is compost and compost tea. So I'm very much about compost as a solution. And not only am I about municipal compost, I think it plays an important role, but I'm about backyard composting as well, and community garden composting. The more we can keep our organic matter situated in a local context and breaking down in a local context and breaking down for a local soil, number one, the better for the microbes. And number two, you know, a reduction in fossil fuels and the massive apparatus required to run an industrial composting system. We see that in good compost, we have a whole universe of diverse soil food web organisms. And I'm quoting Jeff Lowenfels and Wayne Lewis from their excellent book, Teeming with Microbes, right now. Never mind the huge numbers in a good fertile garden soil. The numbers of organisms per teaspoon in compost, especially the microbial populations, are simply too large to fully comprehend. Up to 1 billion bacteria, 400 to 900 feet of fungal hyphae, 10,000 to 50,000 protozoa, and 30 to 300 nematodes. And that is in 1 teaspoon of good compost. In addition, Compost contains all manner of microarthropods, insects, shredders that break down, and sometimes worms. Compost teams with life. And so if we are thinking in terms of sustainability, if we are thinking in terms of making healthy soils so that on a local basis, we can contribute something towards a healthy planet, compost is our best place to start. And if you run a 0.018 acre micro farm, you can say that the compost maker is a farmer of microbes, no less a farmer than a dairy farmer or a vegetable grower. And so what do we want to do in our backyard context? We see, I don't know if Richmond Hill has a composter program anymore. The city of Toronto used to have one, they don't anymore. But I was lucky to get a few before they ended their program. And what are we able to do? We're able to encourage the diversity of microbes. We can accelerate the decomposition process. Organic matter will decompose no matter what, but you got to give it enough time. And in the urban context, we don't always have time, right? We need to accelerate processes a little bit. And certainly with climate change, we don't always have enough time either. So composting can help us accelerate the processes of breaking down and increase soil organic matter in the process. If you're going to do composting in your backyard, you need to think of 4 primary requirements. Number 1 is carbon. And we can think of carbon in terms of things like tree leaves or wood chip, straw. We need nitrogen heavy materials, and we can think of our kitchen food scraps. We can think of our cut lawn clippings and items like that. We can think of animal manures as being high nitrogen. And if you remember back to what made healthy soil, we need aeration and we need moisture. And a lot of people who have started backyard composting and not had success with it and given it up, it wasn't so much because of the carbon and nitrogen, it's because there wasn't enough aeration in their piles and there wasn't enough moisture. And in fact, when I share this photo, I always cringe a little bit because it's dry as a bone. I haven't yet wet it. And so this pile would go nowhere. I mean, it wouldn't do anything. We'll look at it in 2 years and it'll be still as dry and not broken down as it is today. It needs the air and it needs a lot of water, almost like 70% moisture when you begin. As I just mentioned here, so this is the balance, the CN ratio. And here's our browns and greens, our carbon-rich materials, our nitrogen-rich materials. Here's a few examples. And if you go on the internet, you can find dozens upon dozens more for every kind of organic. If it was once living, it can become compost. And so any kind of thing that was once living, you can find a CN ratio for this on the internet somewhere. And I hear you've got the circular economy, upcycling and recycling your garbage. And composting is a big space for this right now. For example, we partner with a chocolate maker in Toronto and get their spent cocoa shells that come out after the roasting process. We partner with Starbucks and get their grounds after they've made coffee. The grounds are an excellent nitrogen source for composting, and so on and so forth. And composting, I think, is an important part of the circular economy to come. Aeration and moisture, I've already said this, so I'm not going to say it again. That's number 1 thing you can do, backyard compost. Number 2, if we're learning from the farmers, we want to think about reducing our tillage, okay? So in your backyard, we don't necessarily want to take up our garden and dig it and turn the soil over and dig down and dig down and dig down, or we don't want to rototill. As little as possible, we want to do things like rototilling. Tilling damages that soil structure, it inverts the layers, it destroys the fungal hyphae that are in the soil, and it compacts. And so what we want to learn from no-till and low-till farmers is, how do we disturb the soil as little as possible when we're planting? Okay, and so we want to dig down and lift up the soil to allow some air in, but we don't want to rototill and we don't want to churn it and we don't want to turn it over as little as possible. Okay, so how do we disturb the soil as little as possible is the question. Farmers teach us that we want to use cover crops. We never want to leave a soil bare. Now, for most of us who are backyard growers, cover crops probably aren't going to be a thing. But if you are growing vegetables in community gardens or have an allotment of that type of thing, at the end of the season, instead of leaving bare soil, to grow a cover crop there. And a cover crop is basically a crop that's not for eating. It's a crop that will grow and keep the photosynthetic processes going, so that those liquid carbon sugars come down and provide living roots to the living microbes. Okay, so instead of leaving the soil bare, in which case all that that buffet dries up, which means the microbes are going to die, and which means your soil can't hold anything anymore. It will start to release CO2 back into the atmosphere. Living root systems keeps everything thriving. And so we can learn from that if we're growing vegetables in community gardens or something like that. If you are a backyard grower, though, of some other type, mulching is super important. Okay, mulching protects the soil from sun and heat fluctuations, in turn conserving moisture. It holds moisture into the soil. And again, we want to keep water in there. We want the soil to hold water like a sponge. If we've learned anything over the last few years, our temperatures in the climate change era are becoming more volatile and fluctuating. So, you know, we'll get a +2 degree today, and it's supposed to be 17 by, you know, in 48 hours time. These kind of fluctuations, especially in the spring and fall, are becoming the norm. Mulching can help protect us from fluctuations. They can reduce weed pressure. They can break down themselves and become soil organic matter, and in turn improve our aeration. So that's another thing that you can do right now. Finally, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's shameless self-promotion. Compost tea is what we make. And for those of you who take probiotics for your own self, for your own gut health, there are a lot of links that we're learning between the microbiome in our guts and the microbiome in our soils. And so when we think about things like probiotic strategies for our gut, whether it's a probiotic tablet or whether it's drinking kombucha or kefir or sauerkraut or whatever it is that's going to feed you probiotics to your gut health, compost tea is something that can do something similar for soil health by creating a drink of healthy microbes that is fed directly to that rhizosphere. So compost tea, Eric Fisher tells us, can be part of the repertoire open to the organic grower looking for an alternative to all the toxicity that's out there. Why compost tea? Well, we just talked about it, but what I want to do is say, what's the difference between compost and composting? Why don't I just compost? Composting is always recommended because you're going to get that bulk matter, the soil organic matter that we've talked about quite a bit, okay? And that builds up our humus layer in the soil over time. But compost tea, on the other hand, because it is essentially a water-based drink, will give you the microbes. And because we feed them, it gives you more microbes than you would get in compost. It takes compost as an inoculant and it multiplies, it feeds them. It's a farming process where we are going to multiply the microbes. Because of that, it's going to go directly to the root zone immediately. So that allows us benefits to, if our plants, we think our soils need microbial health, we can give that right away. Compost takes time to work itself in, right? Unless, especially mid-season. It's hard for us to work in compost to our soils, you know, in the middle of the season. At the beginning, maybe it's fine, but later on, it's lighter in weight. And so if you're growing in containers, it's not going to collapse the kind of potting soil that you would get in containers. And so basically what you're doing is you're taking compost, a mature, biologically active compost. And what I mean by this is you can't go to the garden center and get a bag of compost that's in a plastic bag and has been in a plastic bag for a year. That stuff doesn't breathe. It doesn't live. It's inert. It's functionally dead. What it will give you is some soil organic matter. Great. It might give you some nutrient. Great. Is it biologically active? No. And this is why I really encourage people to make their own compost, because you'll get the microbes in a way that doesn't get killed off in the industrial processes. Water. Well, I've talked already about chlorine and chloramine in our water as antimicrobial agents. We can treat our water when we're making compost tea to remove chlorine and chloramine. We feed the microbes a sugar. In our case, it's molasses. And then we pump oxygen in there so that the microbes have that aeration again. And it's very vigorous pumping, brewing process. And between the oxygen and the sugar, the microbes are going to multiply. And we bottle that and we sell it. This is our setup at Crooked Farmz. We've got multiple, you saw from that diagram, that schematic at the beginning, we've got multiple bins. And what we try and do is do various different composting techniques so that we get biodiversity. This is another key word for us. The more biodiversity, and Lorraine Johnson's going to talk about biodiversity in her next presentation. I encourage you all to attend. She's a fantastic speaker and super knowledgeable, but I'll be shocked if she doesn't mention the word biodiversity multiple times. And we try and do that at the microbial level with our compost as well. Different composts, worm castings, trying to get the fungal compost, and we put it all together to make our tea. And you dilute it. I'm not going to go through all this stuff too carefully right now. Frequently, you can use this frequently because you're doing it as part of your watering program. And this is how our subscribers and our market goers get it. They get it in a 1 liter mason jar. No muss, no fuss. It's pretty simple in terms of packaging and spectacle. And you would take this home and dilute it 20-1. So about a 5-gallon bucket of water to one of these jars. And then you would pour it on your soils, or you can spray it right on top of the plants to give some protection to the leaves of the plants. And that's all I've got. Thank you very much.
Sean, thanks so much. That's wow, that's really interesting. I feel like I personally have a few questions, and I'm not sure if there's others from the listeners. There is one that came in from Karen, just wondering about examples of cover crops. I'm not sure if that's when you were talking about farms versus kind of backyard gardens, but maybe you can just clarify that.
Yeah, absolutely, Karen. You know, cover crops aren't something you're going to use if you have a garden of perennials and flowers and shrubs in the backyard. You know, they're not going to be very picturesque in that sense, but they can be very picturesque in a larger open field or open plot of soil kind of context. So I'm trying to be mindful of the fact that we're in Toronto and Richmond Hill and in backyard context mostly, and so cover crops aren't typically something we would use in the backyard context, but if we were to do so, we can get a cover crop that would do something like build organic matter. And so we could sow oats for that. And some other Sudan grass would be another one, where they're rapid growing plants that are going to, when they're mowed down or killed by putting tarps over them or whatnot, all that biomass breaks down into the soil. We can use a cover crop to take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and fix nitrogen. And don't forget, plants, the number one gas that's in our atmosphere is not oxygen, it's nitrogen. Plants, we've seen, need nitrogen to grow. Plants cannot take nitrogen out of the soil on their own. Nitrogen out of the air on their own. What happens is nitrogen is fixed in the soil by certain types of plants called legumes, and or by certain types of bacteria called rhizobium. So a cover crop that can fix nitrogen into the soil would be something like clover. And lots of farmers would plant clover, but also we increasingly see people that are planting clover lawns in their backyard. And so that's a type of cover crop that has a function of fixing nitrogen. There's another type of cover crop that would serve to break up compaction in the soil. And that would be something like daikon radish. If you've ever seen daikon radish, I mean, they're these humongous, like long white radishes that can be about 12 to 18 inches long, but also thick like this. And so basically what happens is this radish, it just grows and like literally breaks apart the soil. And so in its growth phase, it serves as a cover crop. And then it also provides this extra function of breaking up your soil if you've got a lot of compaction. And so those are some, a few quick examples, but if you Google cover crops, there are so many different kinds, and more we're planting them in mixes. So to get, again, biodiversity. So it'll be a mix of cover crops together that farmers are putting on their fields. And then that will encourage pollinators and insects and all sorts of things as well that keep biodiversity flowing.
Thanks, Sean. And I'm just going to quickly insert my own question because I think it's kind of it works in tandem with the last one with your answer. And then we do have another question from Quincy. But I was wondering, again, going back to the Richmond Hill context, which I know is for a lot of people is a grass lawn. So I'm wondering if, in terms of maybe improving the soil of that kind of typical grass lawn, is it the same principle in terms of adding some diversity into what's growing in the lawn, like for example with clover?
Yeah, that's a tough one. That's a great question, Miles. And it's a tough one because most people have grown that lawn for a particular type of aesthetics, and it's that was established over the 20th century, right? The perfectly manicured sort of green square. Part of what I'm suggesting requires a bit of a rethink of those aesthetics. And it's not to say we don't have to have lawns, but that if we want healthier soils and we want to achieve some of these things that I've been talking about, the more we can plant diversity in that lawn, even if that's going to maybe imperfect the green square a little bit, is something that we'd like to do. And also remembering that if you recall that ecological succession chart that I showed about midway through, grasses and lawns tend to be down more at the bacterial end of the spectrum, but they are not at the complete end of that spectrum where bare dirt is. And so we need some kind of fungal ratio growing there a little bit for a lawn to thrive. And this is where compost tea can be helpful. Sometimes it's hard to put compost right over top of a lawn, but compost tea can be helpful because it's something that you can spray on, or it's something you can water in. And so you get that microbial life starting to build underneath the soil or underneath your established lawn. But again, it's partly about how do we shift our aesthetics of what the lawn looks like. Because as we see, the lawn is really monocrop agriculture. And if we're learning anything, that monocrop agriculture is devastating, on a global scale. The manicured lawn is the comparable version of that on the micro scale.
Got it. Okay. Thank you for that. Okay, so a couple more questions, and I know it's we're right at about 8 o'clock, so we'll try to just squeeze these in. So the first one is from Quincy, and I think there's an image, but I'm sorry, Quincy, I'm not able to pull it up. The question is around stacked planters, and basically do you have experience with those, and what's your opinion on them?
I'm sorry, I do not have experience with stacked planters. I'm not even sure what they refer to. And I don't know if you mean stacked planters for growing plants or some of the stacked composting type planters. And so I can't help you with either of those, actually.
Quincy, feel free to unmute and clarify if you'd like. I assume that's why the screenshot was helpful here, but yeah, I'm afraid I'm not able to open that right now.
Yeah.
In the meantime, I'll put forward Stella's question, which is for her community plot, they were making compost tea And the ingredients are fruit and peels, so things like orange, mango, apple, banana, plus brown sugar, plus water. What is your opinion on that list of ingredients?
Are the fruit and the peels composted first, or is it literally just fruit and peels? That'd be my question.
Well, actually, the fruit are in its old peel. Sometimes if this is fresh fruit, and I would put part of it, like banana, you know, ripe banana, and I put it in a bottle, a big bottle, and 10% brown sugar, about 30% fruit, and about 50% is water, and let it fermentate for about 3 months. Then I would use the water to put on my plot. So basically, they smell so good, they like wine, like a white wine.
Exactly. Yes,
And
Stella, you've got a great wine recipe there.
yeah, and well, when I put it, I think my whole pot smells so well. So I just want to know how effective this in comparing with the compost tea that you mentioned.
Okay.
Is that any different?
It is very different. What you're doing, Stella, is feeding nutrients. Basically, the fruit itself won't have enough microbial. There's microbes in everything, right? So there will be microbes on your fruit, just like there's microbes on my head right now. There's microbes in everything, but you will not have the same quantity or spectrum of diversity from that fruit as you would have from a couple of shovelfuls of good compost. So what you're actually doing is breaking down over that fermentation period that you're describing, you're breaking down the sugars in the fruit. The fruit is going to have, oftentimes banana is one of these things that we use in a mix like this, because banana is high in potassium. And that's the K in our NPK. So if we want potassium in there, we break down the banana over time, we dilute that out, and we pour it into our soils. And what that is doing is giving a good drink of potassium and phosphorus to the soil, but it's not going to be giving the microbes in the same way.
Okay, one more question. This year I was planning to put commercial compost, the bag that got from Cantai, and as well worm casting. So with these two other ingredients that add onto my plot, will they sort of like compensate the loss of the ingredient or all the other
It will help a lot.
things?
Yeah, it will help a lot, particularly the worm castings. The worm castings are far healthier and far more microbially diverse, and particularly if you can get them fresh. The fresher you can get them, the better. Mm-hmm. That'll be a big help. I'm personally not always as optimistic about a bag compost, but of course I understand everybody's got to use it. We don't all make our own backyard compost, but those things are going to help bring the microbes back a little bit more than and complement what you're doing with your fermented fruit juice.
Okay, thank you very much. You answered my question. I always have my compost tea in doubt, and sort of how effective this will, benefit my vegetables. Yeah, now you answer my questions. Yeah.
And great. Stella, if you'd like, you can contact me by email, and I can send you a video on how to make compost tea if you like.
Great, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Yeah, thanks.
Super, thanks for that question. And just as a reminder, I will send out some resources, including Sean's website and contact information for those exact kind of follow-up questions. We do have, we're past 8, sorry. I'm just thinking if anyone might have one other question to put to Sean. Hopefully he doesn't mind sticking around for one more.
One more question is great. Let's end on a good note. If
not, I have one lined up, but definitely if anyone's interested to type one in the chat or unmute, please go ahead. If not, I've got one. All right.
Okay, you go ahead.
I think I'll go for it. So I'm going to tie this back a bit to what we do at the city, and one of our big programs, successful programs, is our Healthy Yards program, which promotes native plants. So helps people to get native plants into their yards. And as you said, our next session will be focusing more on those types of plants. I'm just wondering, what do you see as the relationship, I guess, between healthy soils and native plants? So why, like, or is there, is it better to have native plants in your garden, in your yard, for the soil versus non-native, I guess?
Well, I think one of the things I hope Lorraine will talk about is again climate change and climate instability. And one thing with native plants is that they've adapted to our landscapes for centuries, and things we brought in that are introduced into our ecosystem via the garden center or the big box retailer. These are things that have been sort of genetically determined in labs, and then they're sold across the province and across the country, or across the continent, and it will not have the same adaptability that we will need going forward. And that's the nice thing about native species, is that they are already part of that food web. Now I showed a food web that was strictly animal and fungi based and bacteria based. But if we think about the plants that are part of that as well, they're part of an ecosystem, and they have developed relationships with these other animals over centuries and millennia. And so I think that is to maintain a sort of homeostatic balance or some kind of equilibrium that is healthy in a period of climate instability. The more we can do to maintain stability through a biodiversity that is native in orientation, I think is important to me.